einer japanischen Kirchengemeinde erwartet man von einer Frau eine Frauenrolle. Aber hier in der deutschen Gemeinde darf man einfach so sein, egal ob eine Frau oder ein Mann.
Und für mich als Angehöriger des Auswärtigen Amtes in unserem Wanderzirkusleben, wo wir 4 Jahre hier, 5 Jahre dort tätig sind, ist die Mitarbeit in der deutschen Evangelischen Kirchengemeinde an all meinen Dienstorten immer wichtig gewesen.
Es ist ja eine kleine Kirchengemeinde, eine selbstständige Kirchengemeinde, die anders als Kirchengemeinden in Deutschland und der Schweiz keine Organisation einer Landeskirche oder Kantonalkirche hinter sich haben. Es ist auch eine Gemeinde, die keinen festen Vertrag mit der Evangelischen Kirche in Deutschland hat. Es ist eine unabhängige Gemeinde.
The German-speaking Protestant Church of Osaka, Kobe, or Evangelische Kirchengemeinde Kobe, EKK, was established 150 years ago. It is a small but active church that has come through war, disaster, and years of great change. We hope this video, which looks back over the eventful history of the church since its start in April 1871, will serve as a memory for the church in the future. Japan in 1853. Japan had maintained an isolationist policy for 250 years, but that ended with the arrival of American warships off the coast of what is now Tokyo. This demonstration of power heralded the opening of Japan to the West and the end of feudal rule. With the emperor resuming the role of head of state, Japan began to modernize with incredible speed. On New Year's Day, 1868, the port of Kobe was opened to international trade. Quite a few ships with up to 30 German passengers on board were waiting. In the sector designated for use by foreigners, land close to the port was naturally very desirable. German merchants found themselves vying for good spots with traders from Britain, America, France, and the Netherlands. The land in the foreign settlement was sandy marshland that had to be developed. The settlers drained the land, constructed wharves, quays, and roads, and built warehouses and sturdy homes for themselves. Bricks to build all this were brought from as far away as Shanghai and even Glasgow. In the ensuing years, the port of Kobe grew into the largest trading port in East Asia. With its European-looking streets lined with acacias, willows, and gas lampposts, the foreign settlement in Kobe became a model for Western-style living in East Asia. The geography of Kobe was another reason for its popularity. Rising directly behind the seaside district are the Rokko Mountains, reaching peaks of 900 some meters. European residents of Kobe spent the hot and humid summers at holiday homes up in the hills. The British and Germans accounted for the largest part of Kobe's foreign residents. Many of the Germans were young merchants assigned to Kobe from trading houses in northern Germany. The foreign settlement was an extraterrestrial area under its own jurisdiction. Foreign residents, however, were not allowed to move freely outside the settlement. This restriction was in place because the Japanese government feared unhindered Western influence on the local people. Similarly, Christianity was also prohibited until the early years of the Meiji period, and defying the prohibition was a capital offense. Of course, Christian religious activities were allowed inside the foreign settlement. 1870, Daniel Crosby Green. Many of the Americans in Kobe were missionaries. Protestant missionaries from North America were particularly active. One of these was the missionary Daniel Crosby Green, who arrived in Kobe in 1869. He was holding regular Protestant services by the end of 1870. At first, these services were held with just a few worshippers in the Freemasons' Hall. But with the support of several consuls, some 20 foreigners came together in April 1871 to form a church. In November 1872, a dedication service was held at the first church building of what eventually became Kobe Union Church. The church's name then was the Union Church of Christ. Funding for construction came from donations received from Kobe and the United States. German East Asia mission activities got underway in the mid-1880s. By basing their activities on a liberal theology, the German missionaries took a different approach from that of many of the other missionary societies. They were not lay people, but were instead missionaries with solid theological training. The first of these missionaries to Japan was Wilfred Spinner, who was sent to Kobe in 1888. The arrival of the missionary Emil Schiller in Kyoto in 1901 was a milestone in the history of EKK. Schiller spent 36 years in Japan and was one of the founders of the German-speaking church in Kobe. Around this time, there were 150 Germans living in Kobe, some 80% of them young men. With the arrival of more German families, the Deutsche Schule School, a school for the German community, was established in 1909. In 1914, Japanese and British troops took the German colony at Qingdao by force. Some 4,000 German prisoners were interned in camps in Japan until the end of World War I. In 1917, the German merchant and sometime composer Han Ramsecker organized a charity concert at the church to benefit the interned German prisoners. The funds raised at the concert, worth 340,000 yen in today's money, were provided to the prisoners in Japan and Serbia. Many of the interned Germans remained in Japan at the end of the war, beginning new lives. In contrast, many of the German traders who had long lived in Japan found themselves having to leave the country, their German-based companies having been seized as reparations. A devastating earthquake struck Tokyo in 1923, and many foreigners living in the Kanto area relocated to Kobe in the aftermath. The economy boomed, and exports of tea and silk turned Kobe into the most important port in East Asia. Many new merchants came to Kobe from Germany. After the foreign settlement returned to Japanese control in 1899, Japanese were also allowed to live and establish businesses there. The area around Kobe Union Church developed into a vibrant business district that bustled with activity even on the weekends. The church building became too small for the growing congregation, so it was decided to move to a more secluded area on the north side of Sannomiya Station. The architect called on to design the new church building was the American William Merrill Voorhees. When the church was completed in 1929, it was considered one of the loveliest church buildings in Japan. There was likely no building that stood in brighter contrast to the low-slung traditional wooden houses that filled the Ikuta-cho neighborhood. A dedication service for the new building was held jointly by the English-speaking and German-speaking pastors. By 1933, the first chapter of the National Socialist German Workers' Party had been established in Japan. However, in Kobe, fewer people joined than had been anticipated. In 1935, about 40% of the members of the German social club, Club Concordia, were registered Nazi Party members. However, the majority of these were young men without high social standing. The Nazis were met with rejection by more cosmopolitan, long-term Kobe residents. Why did the Nazi Party not gain its hoped-for number of members in Kobe? A major reason for this was the missionary Egon Hessel. Hessel was dispatched to Kyoto by the East Asia Mission in 1931. While serving as pastor at the German-speaking church in Kobe, Hessel also taught religion at the Deutsche Schule Kobe, the German school. Right from the beginning, he made no secret of his aversion to the Nazi Party. Hessel was also very active in the Emergency Covenant of Pastors, which was organized in protest against the Aryan Paragraph, which limited membership in various organizations to members of the Aryan race, and excluded non-Aryan Christians, such as those with a Jewish background, from membership to the German Evangelical Church. With the conclusion of the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936, Germany and Japan began working more closely together. The German embassy in Tokyo was a major center of political activity, and many diplomats joined the Nazi Party. Egon Hessel maintained his critical stance towards the party, and as a result, he was dismissed from his position in 1936. Part of the church community continued to support Hessel, however, and he continued leading worship services. With the support of the confessing church, he kept working as a freelance missionary, and in 1940, he immigrated to the United States. Limar Hennig took up the post of pastor for the remaining members of the German Christian Church, and later he also served on behalf of the East Asia Mission in Kyoto. After the November pogrom, also known as Kristallnacht, in 1938, Jewish residents of Kobe began to feel excluded from the German community. This was true even among members of the German-speaking church. But pastors Egon Hessel and Limar Hennig were notable exceptions. Still, this tolerance was only extended to people considered Jewish according to German race law, but who were raised as Christians. Between 1939 and 1941, more than 2,000 Eastern European Jews came to Kobe. They managed to escape the Holocaust thanks to transit visas issued by Chiune Sugihara, Vice Consul for Japan in Lithuania. Roy Smith, a consul member of the English-speaking congregation, asked the German-speaking congregation to agree to let the Jewish refugees use a room at the church to meet in. But this request was furiously rejected by the German church's governing board. Upon the invasion of the Netherlands by Germany in 1940, Germans on the island of Java became enemy aliens, and many fled to Kobe. The German-speaking congregation now swelled to more than 180 households, becoming the largest non-Japanese church in Kobe. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, Americans remaining in Japan either were taken into custody or had to leave the country. Almost all the English-speaking members left, and Reverend Hennig ended up also leading English language worship. In 1940, the Japanese government forced all Protestant churches in Japan to become part of the United Church of Christ in Japan, UCCJ. In March of 1942, the Kobe Union Church building was taken over by the UCCJ. Shortly thereafter, the Kobe Hilano Church purchased the building for 88,000 yen. In current monetary terms, this was the price for a small single-family home in Kobe. Thanks to the efforts of Reverend Hennig, worship services continued to be held at KUC. However, Reverend Hennig had to provide proof that while there were Japanese among the English-speaking members, there were no Americans. The 1944 Christmas worship service was attended by Germans, Japanese, British, Russians, Swiss, Dutch, and Americans. Towards the end of the war, Kobe was repeatedly carpet-bombed by the Americans. Airstrikes in 1945 destroyed much of the church building. In 1946, the church passed into the hands of the British, who briefly occupied Kobe after the war. As part of post-war denazification efforts, American occupation forces required many of the Germans in Japan to return to Germany in 1947. As a result, only 700 of the 3,000 or so Germans who had been in Japan remained. After intensive negotiations with the American occupation authorities, Reverend Hennig and the church board were able to regain possession of the church building. The well-known translator of No and theology Professor Herman Bonner came to Japan as a prisoner of war during World War I. But he became a pastor for the congregation and led worship on special holidays. The rebuilding of KUC progressed only slowly, in part because the American members refused on moral grounds to use reparation funds from the Japanese government for the church. Instead, led by Frank Carey, the moderator of the English-speaking Congregations Council, they insisted that they go to their Japanese neighbors first. So worship was held outside in sunny weather and under cover on the lower floor when it rained. With the outbreak of the Korean War, the U.S. military used Japan as a resupply point, boosting the Japanese economy. In 1951, the Treaty of San Francisco was signed, and Japan regained full sovereignty. The German General Consul Kobe, Osaka was established in 1953. Many Germans returned to the area, and in short order, some 300 Germans lived within the area administered by the consulate, and the German school reopened. In 1953, Reverend Harold Ohler of the East Asia Mission in Tokyo agreed to come and serve the German-speaking congregation in Kobe. Providing charitable support to local institutions became an important focus of church activities. And starting in 1954, the congregation collected used clothing to send via Hamburg with the help of the consulate to recipients in East Germany. At the end of the 1950s, the congregation was a church home to about 80 households. Counting the children, that would have meant a number easily exceeding 150 people. It was at this time that the church became officially known as Evangelische Kirchengemeinde Kobe, Osaka, or EKK. In 1962, Werner Rilz became head of the church board, a position he served in until 1980. In addition to his teaching activities at Osaka University, Rilz also made essential contributions to rebuild the German school in Kobe, the Goethe Institute Osaka, the Society for East Asia, OAG, and the Japanese-German Society of Kobe. From the end of the 1950s until the oil crisis of 1973, Japan experienced a period of very rapid economic growth. As the largest container port in Asia and the third largest in the world, Kobe attracted more and more German families. The German school and EKK were at a high point central to community life for Germans in the Kansai region. Since resumption of church activities in the mid-1950s, various German-speaking missionaries and theologians in Kansai had been asked to lead the worship services. All other tasks, such as administration, finance, and activity planning, were handled by volunteers. It was thanks to the German General Consul Wolfgang Galinski that in 1971, the philosophy professor and theologian Klaus Spenman began serving EKK as pastor. Over the many ensuing years, Reverend Spenman's sermons, which were often more philosophical in nature than theological, touched many people. Some who had never attended church before arriving in Japan even became regular attenders. Reverend Spenman served EKK for 35 years, providing a spiritual and emotional home for those who were far away from home.
Herr Galinski sagte dann, Sie sind doch evangelischer Pfarrer. Es ist doch eigentlich selbstverständlich, dass ein evangelischer Pfarrer am Leben der Kirchengemeinde in Kobe teilnimmt. Warum haben Sie das noch nie getan? Tja, dann musste ich mich da ja mal sehen lassen und dann bin ich da mal hin. Ich glaube, die erste Predigt habe ich im Juni 1970 gehalten. Dass daraus dann eine Liaison von 35 Jahren wurde, das habe ich mir nicht vorgestellt.
The German missionary Elsbeth Strom opened a daycare facility for socially vulnerable families in Kamagasaki, a downtrodden section of Osaka. In 1972, she also established the Kibonole, a therapy center for day laborers struggling with alcohol dependency. Through Strom's work, the German-speaking congregation also became familiar with the darker side of Japanese society. Strom's successor, Bodo Walter, also served as the chairman of the board of EKK during the 1980s. The church began donating a portion of the proceeds from the Advent Bazaar to welfare organizations.
Der Bodo Walter war ein völlig anderer Typ wieder. Und er war eigentlich der Erste, der aus einer soliden kirchlichen Tradition kam. Das wirkte sich so in den Gottesdiensten und so weit weniger aus. Aber zum Beispiel hat er das, ich würde mal sagen, das ökumenische und diakonische Element eingeführt. Er selbst war zugleich in der japanischen Gesellschaft stark verankert, gehörte zur japanischen lutherischen Kirche und hat eigentlich der Gemeinde die Augen dafür geöffnet, dass es andere, also japanische Kirchen gab. Ja?
Church maintenance grew to be a significant problem during the 1980s. It was decided to construct a new building at a different location. Thanks to the ongoing real estate bubble, the old building sold for a large sum. It stood vacant for a number of years, but at the end of the 1990s, the German-style bakery Freudlib purchased the church building and converted it into a bakery and cafe. The fashionable cafe in a church has become a popular tourist spot. Kalin Kurada took on the role of chairman of the board in the 1990s and oversaw the move to the new church building. A dedication ceremony was held in the fall of 1992. Funds from the sale of the old building that were left over after construction of the new building were used to establish an endowment. This endowment continues to cover maintenance of the church. Kobe and the surrounding area were struck by a massive earthquake in January 1995, and more than 6,400 lives were lost. However, the church building escaped damage, and the church was able to serve as an important distribution point for relief supplies for the neighborhood. Since 2003, Nami Uchiyama, a German church music school trained professional organist, has been EKK's organist. In 2010, Andreas Rusterholz joined the church as pastor. For the first time in the long history of EKK, Reverend Rusterholz serves not only as a pastor, but also as board member and as a member of the board of trustees.
Den Pfarrer braucht es auch, weil die Gottesdienste müssen durchgeführt werden. Und selbst wenn die Gottesdienste langweilig sind, die Leute kommen, weil sie sich nach dem Gottesdienst dann treffen können, oder? Das gehört dann zum Gemeindeleben dazu. Es geht nicht ohne Pfarrer, aber die eigentliche Leitung und auch viele Initiativen gehen vor allem vom Vorstand aus. In der Schweiz war ich als Pfarrer in einer Gemeinde in der Stadt Zürich tätig. Zum Gemeindeleben gehörten neben dem Gottesdienst auch viele Aktivitäten unter der Woche, die dann zum Teil vom Pfarrer geleitet wurden, zum Teil von diakonischen Mitarbeitern. Hier in Japan beschränkt sich das Gemeindeleben auf den Sonntag. Es gibt, abgesehen von 2-3 Ausflügen pro Jahr, eigentlich kein weiteres Gemeindeleben. Ein großer Unterschied ist auch, dass hier sehr wenig Kasualien stattfinden. Also wenig Taufen, wenig Hochzeiten, Konfirmationen oder auch Beerdigungen. Kasualien bieten immer die Möglichkeit, mit Leuten, die sonst nicht zur Kirche kommen, ins Gespräch zu kommen und so einen größeren Kreis an Menschen anzusprechen und auch etwas von deren Bedürfnissen zu erfahren. Das ist hier in Japan leider nicht möglich.
In the immediate post-war period, most German-speaking foreigners in Japan were practicing Christians. Attending church was part of everyday life. However, in the 1980s, Europe became increasingly secularized, and this trend continued overseas. Busy with their expat lives, many Europeans living in Kansai found less time for church. the number of church members decreased. In the 1970s, EKK celebrated confirmations every year, but today these have become a rarity. The church used to be a place for people to gather. People went to church. However, these days it seems as though church no longer has a place in society. So the church has sought to expand its activities beyond just worship services. These activities range from camping events for children and families to Zen meditation, concerts, field trips, and various women's groups.
Unsere westliche Gesellschaft hat sich geändert. Kirche hat heute einen anderen Stellenwert als zur Gründungszeit, vor, zwischen und nach den Kriegen. Es war ein schleichender Prozess. Die Zusammensetzung und die Größe der deutschsprachigen Gemeinschaft hier in Kansai hat sich auch über die Jahre sehr verändert. Anfangs waren es vor allem alleinstehende junge Männer, in den 60er bis 90er Jahren vor allem Expatriates-Familien. Und heute haben wir eine sehr gemischte kleine Kongregation mit deutsch sprechenden Japanern, gemischten Familien und Einzelpersonen. Durch dieses gemeinsame Schaffen und Erarbeiten, durch das Einbringen der verschiedenen Gaben entsteht eine Gemeinschaft, in der jeder mit seiner Persönlichkeit anerkannt und geschätzt wird. Das gemeinsame Arbeiten wird zur Bereicherung und kreiert frische und neue Energie in unserer unruhigen Zeit.
The church also collected donations to help those in need following the 2011 triple disaster in Tohoku. Some of the funds were used to start up a self-help project for single mothers. The church also supports a self-help project for women in India. Joined by Reverend Claudia Gunage of KUC, members of EKK attended the UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai. EKK also took part in celebrations of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation in Germany. EKK continues to reach out. It is not unusual to see a new face at worship services. Church members include not only Germans and Swiss, but also Japanese. Each person's active participation strengthens the bonds of our community.
Ist es, meine ich, der Kirche in Kobe immer gelungen, die Menschen da abzuholen, wo sie waren, ne? Ob da nun Gesprächskreise sind, ein Frauentreff oder auch Wanderungen. Es ist ein Stück Kirche in Kobe. Und solange die Kirche das weiterführen kann, meine ich, hat sie in Kobe eine Zukunft.